Welcome to Fed by Fire, the podcast where we don't just chase headlines, we break down the systems that feed them. I'm your host, Christian Whitlow. First, a quick disclaimer. The content in this video is for educational and awareness purposes only. It is not intended to promote, glamorize, or condone any form of illegal activity. The stories discussed are meant to encourage self-reflection and understanding to help viewers recognize warning signs and learn from real events, and if needed, make positive changes in their own lives. All individuals mentioned are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And today we are talking about something a lot of people get wrong on purpose. How the U.S. government is starting, to treat drug cartels not just as criminals, but as terrorists. And we've talked about this a lot on the channel. Not because the people suddenly got more evil, but because this is how the machine works. And when it hits a crisis point, we're looking at a, superseding indictment out of the Southern District of California against Rana Garcia, aka Rana, a Sinaloa cartel plaza boss out of Tijuana. He's charged with narco-terrorism, material support of terrorism, a continuing criminal enterprise, international drug conspiracy, and money laundering. On paper, that sounds like they've turned a drug trafficker into the next Bin Laden. But I don't want you to get stuck on the cartoon version of that. I don't see this kind of figure as a movie villain. This is something we see on this channel all the time. I see him as a node in a system. America demands product, money piles up, and someone steps into the role managing territory, routes, and violence. Governments respond with their own tools, new laws, new labels, new powers. Nobody in this story is magic. They're all doing exactly what their incentives tell them to do. To understand why this indictment matters, we start with geography, not morality. Tijuana sits directly across from San Diego, one of the busiest legal border crossings on the planet. Billions of dollars in legitimate goods move through that corridor every day. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people also cross back and forth every week to work, shop, study, or see family. But that legal flow is the bloodstream of the region. And anywhere you have a big, fast bloodstream, you got parasites. According to the U.S. prosecutors, Lorena controlled what's known as the Tijuana Plaza for the Sinaloa cartel. A plaza boss isn't flashy. It's a nickname. It's a job description. Inside an informal government, you manage territory, you manage the smuggling routes, and you manage enforcement crews. You also manage the corruption networks that keep police and officials looking the other way so you can do your thing. You tax smaller traffickers for use of your corridor, and when people don't comply, you manage violence. And that's not random chaos. That's, governance. Just not the kind, you vote for. Under that structure, the government says thousands of keys of Fetty, ice, blow, but the usual, made their way to the United States, and Fetty in particular has flipped the overdose crisis into something that looks less like a crime problem and more like a rolling mass casualty event. And once you cross that line, the federal mindset shifts. It's no longer how do we stop smugglers, it becomes who is attacking our communities. And that's where the word narco-terrorism walks in the door. On paper, narco-terrorism is when large-scale drug trafficking intersects with acts meant to intimidate or destabilize civilians or governments. Material support of terrorism means you're tied in some way to a group the U.S. has officially stamped as a foreign terrorist organization or an FTO. And, that's not a small step. That label is a key that unlocks a whole other toolbox. surveillance, asset freezes, sanctions, and a different level of international pressure. So the real story here isn't one bad guy got worse. The real story is that the United States has now chosen to put a cartel like Sinaloa in the same legal bucket as foreign terror groups. But not because the drug trade suddenly changed overnight, but because the overdose numbers, they don't lie. The politics and the frustration with the war on drugs all collided at the same time when the old tools, didn't work and they didn't look like they were working. The system reaches for bigger ones, and that's the vibe I want you to stay in as we keep going. We're not here, to be impressed by these charges or scared by buzzwords. We're here to look at the structure. A plaza boss treating Tijuana, like a franchise, a federal government upgrading its labels to terrorist, and a border that functions as both a lifeline for normal life and a highway for poison. In the next beat of this segment, we're going to look at how this indictment fits into Lorena's long-running history with the U.S. law enforcement and why there's now multi-million-dollar reward money on his head, and how terrorism language changes the game, not just for him, but for how America polices its own crisis. Now we shift from the border and terror labels to something a lot less glamorous and a lot more honest. How the machine actually shows up in American neighborhoods, where in suburban Atlanta, not a cartel stronghold, not a war zone, a backyard, lawns, fences, kids' bikes. According to federal filings, 3 men from Mexico are arrested. Their names Sergio Cortez Nye and Christian Martinez Lombare Dominguez and Jose Angel Cortez Raquel. The allegation is simple and ugly. They were running an ICE conversion lab in a tent behind a house, a few steps away from families and schools. Now, if you only listen to the press conferences, you'll hear words like audacity, cartel, footprint, and, threat to our communities, which they are. And from the government side of the chessboard, that's exactly how they're trained to see it. But if we stay with this same vibe as segment 1, we're not here to pretend that these guys invented evil. We're here to show you how a global supply chain plugs into one random backyard. And here's what agents say would happen. On February 20th, 2026, DEA and local partners hit a house in Brookhaven with a search warrant. In the backyard, inside the tent, they say they find Dominguez and Cortez Raquel actively converting ice, taking bulk product, and, breaking it down into a form that can be sold easily and moved. Cortez Raquel tries to run. He doesn't get very far. A little distance away at a storage unit, they arrest another, co-defendant, Cortez Nye, that he was allegedly tied into the same operation. The numbers don't matter, not because the big numbers are scarier. They matter because they tell you where in the pipeline this lab sits. And agents report about 100 pounds of liquid was mixed into concentrate plus another 50 liters of solution. That's not user stash. That's not a couple guys just catching a buzz. That's a node that exists to process product at scale and push it downstream. And it tells you this tent is not the origin and not the end. It's a middle step in a larger system. Then, there's the second piece. On Cortez Raquel, an older indictment tied to more than 2,000 pounds of ice hidden in celery shipments at the Atlanta State Farmers Market, back in 2024, one of the biggest ice seizures in U.S. history, allegedly, coordinated by the same guy who's now standing in a backyard tent, and you can see the shape of the network. International load and produce, local lab to continue feeding the market. Now, listen to the language, around it. The U.S. attorney talks about the insanity of, cooking next to the families and children and the promise to keep cartels out of North Georgia neighborhoods. DEA leadership emphasizes that the disregard for human life, and at a certain level, that's fair. An ice lab can, have a lot of hazardous chemicals that can leach into the soil and water, and fumes can poison a whole block. There are real risks here, but I want you to notice something. The system turns 3 men into the threat, while the demand that makes their job possible is treated like background noise. All 3 are described as Mexican citizens in the country illegally, facing federal ICE trafficking charges. One of them also carries the 2004 conspiracy case on his back, and the penalties are heavy. The intent is clear. Hit them hard and send a message and show the public that law enforcement is on offense. And again, I'm not here to defend, what they're accused of doing. I'm here to point out that this is the same pattern we saw with Rana, just scaled down. The structure is similar, a product people in the U.S. are willing to buy, a network that moves it across the borders, into cities, and down into neighborhoods, and it just keeps going down. A handful of people who step into the role the market created. A government that defines those people as the visible threat and then brings down the full weight of the system on that visible piece. Backyard ice labs are an easy villain. They're dirty, dangerous, and close to home, but they're also disposable, and you can arrest these 3, and if the upstream structure stays untouched and the demand stays hot, the machine just finds 3 more people. The community impact is real. These labs mean fire risk, toxic waste that can kill, and slow grinding damage of addiction spreading through the neighborhoods. And parents don't care about supply chains. They care what is happening a fence away from their kids' bedrooms. And the real tension is this: the same country that is consuming their product is also staging the raid and holding the press conference. The same system that left gaps in labor markets, immigration policy, and local economies now points all its moral outrage at 3 guys in a tent, and it's easier to call them a threat than to admit how many American institutions profit from ignore or enable the conditions that make this profitable. So when you hear about the Brookhaven Ice Lab, don't just picture a cartel cell hiding in your suburb. Picture a global assembly line that runs from chemical suppliers to cooks to transporters to street level dealers, and 3 men who happen to be standing at one workstation when, the hammer dropped. Picture a government that has very few tools for fixing demand, poverty, or corruption, but lots of tools for raids, charges, and press releases. And that's the pattern. As we move into segment 3, when we talk about a multi-county network in Indiana moving Fetty, ice, blow, with guns and cash stacked beside it, I want you to keep that lens different. State different, faces different, the same machine. Now we move to Indiana. And again, I want you to watch the system, not just the suspects. This isn't a border plaza or a backyard tent. This is a Midwestern multi-county drug network that looks on paper exactly like what the drug war was always supposed to be about. A local crew moving serious weight, armed up, and wired into the wider supply chain. Between October 2022 and November 2023, prosecutors say 7 people, Moore, Kendall, Young, Robertson, Wampler, Fox, were all members working together to move, these drugs across central and southern Indiana. And at the center, they put one name in bold: Kendall. an Indianapolis base described as the leader, the guy who, according to the government, uses threats and intimidation to keep everyone else in line. But let's be clear about the scale. They're alleging at least 108 kilos of ice, 4 kilos of Fetty, and 6 kilos of blow. That's not corner hustle, that's wholesale. That's product designed to saturate towns, counties, and small cities. That's the kind of numbers that show you this, is distribution arm is not a side gig. On November 8, 2023, law enforcement hits them all at once. Multiple search warrants the same day, same operation, houses, cars, stash locations. They say they find 250,000 dirty 30s, 350 grams of rock, 225 grams of powder, and half a kilo of Fetty laced with xylazine. For people listening who don't live in this world, xylazine is a veterinarian tranquilizer. It slows your breathing and your heart rate and blood pressure, and it also makes overdoses harder to reverse. When you hear trank dope, that's a combo. But again, don't just look at it as drugs. Look at what's sitting next to them. Investigators report semi-automatic pistols, revolvers, rifles, and a 12-gauge shotgun, along with hundreds of rounds of ammo, cutting agents, digital scales, burner phones, and close to $900,000 in currency. That's the starter pack for a regional operation. And you've got protection, measurement, communication, and liquidity. The tools you need to turn bulk product into small deadly bites scattered across a whole region. Now, hear the official narrative and compare it to what we've already talked about. This U.S. attorney calls it a major victory for Indiana communities, and the DA says this crew poses a serious threat to public safety. The IRS and the CI talks about removing both the traffickers and their drugs from the streets and sending a message that none of this is tolerated. And from their angle, a crew like this absolutely raises the risk of overdose, violence, and chaos anywhere they operate. But here's the same tension again. The system is set up to treat these 7 people as the danger, even though, they're just one group occupying a slot in the market created. And we take a structural problem, demand, despair, profit, motive, and we assign it a face, a case number, and a press conference. So think about the differences and the similarities. In Atlanta, the threat was a backyard lab in a tent. In Indiana, the threat is a multi-county network with guns, pills, and dope moving across highways. And on the border, the threat is a plaza boss coordinating, cargo through ports of entry, different scale, different visuals, but the same logic. Someone is always ready to fill the role that pays. The Indiana case is interesting because it shows a more professional domestic structure, and you have the storage, the transport, and the distribution broken into pieces, and you have cutting agents and packaging to stretch the product and increase profit. You have weapons to protect the territory and money. It's all the ingredients for a RICO. The business is a bloody one, but a business. Like any business, when one branch goes down, the market doesn't disappear. Competition moves, the underlings recognize. New suppliers step up and the headlines change. But the current keeps flowing underneath. From the government side, this is the playbook. Build a task force, share intel, coordinate raids, take down as much infrastructure as you can in one hit. You grab the dope, you grab the guns, the phones, the cars, the cash, you freeze what money you can find, and you indict everybody you can tie in. You stand up at a podium and say, we've made our community safer, in which they have, and that's true. The fewer pills on the street that week, fewer loaded guns in those houses, fewer people driving around with, product in their in their trunks, while your kids are on the road. But just like with Rana and just like with the Atlanta lab, that's not the same thing as fixing the system. The people in this Indiana crew, they didn't invent the demand. They didn't design the chemistry. They didn't build the economic conditions that, make dealing look like the best or only option. They stepped into roles the machine already had waiting, just mixed with their circumstances. And that's, what I want you to hear is the border plaza bosses, the suburban cooks, the Midwestern distributors, they're all different faces of the same supply chain with the same endings. Federal, state, and local law enforcement are different faces of the same response machine. The threat label gets slapped on whichever node is easiest to put in cuffs and, show on the evening news. So as we leave Indiana and head into our final segment of the night, a crude oil tanker moving sanctioned barrels for a foreign regime. So keep this in mind, whether it's dope or diesel or ice or oil, the pattern is the same. Networks, infrastructure, money, labels, and public messaging. The question isn't just how bad are these people, it's what kind of system keeps producing the same roles no matter how many individual players we remove. Now, we pull the camera all the way back off the streets, off the interstates, and out onto the open water. So, we've talked about dope and neighborhoods. This last piece is about oil and nations. Different product, same machine. The case centers on a crude oil tanker called the Skipper. In December 2025, U.S. authorities grabbed the ship on the high seas along with about 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan crude oil. On paper, it's a civil forfeiture case. In reality, it's about choking off money that flows into the hands of people Washington has decided are the enemies. And here's the basic allegation. The Skipper is part of a shadow fleet moving sanctioned oil from places like Iran and Venezuela to buyers who either don't care about sanctions or actively want to help those regimes dodge them. So we're talking ship-to-ship transfers at sea, turning off tracker systems, swapping flags, and lying about where the cargo came from and where it's going. It's the maritime version of hiding ice and celery, just with billions of dollars in geopolitics layered on top. The U.S. says revenue from these shipments feeds the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, including, the Quds Force, the same IRGC that's been officially labeled a foreign terrorist organization on paper. So the logic looks very similar. If the money stream supports a group that you've tagged as a terrorist organization, then the ship and the oil become material support. And once you accept that framing, you've turned a commercial asset into a target. And again, notice the pattern. Nobody is pretending the Skipper is some haunted villain ship. It's a piece of infrastructure, a floating truck in a global market that runs on demand, profit, and loopholes. The crew and the owners, the middlemen, they all had a job to do. They were filling slots in a system that already exists. The U.S. government steps in and says that slot right there is now legally radioactive. So you get this multi-agency play. Intelligence tracks the vessel's movements and fake identities, sanctions, lawyers line up all, the designations and legal arguments. Investigators build the financial trail to see who's paying, who's receiving, and where the money lands. Then a forfeiture complaint hits and the ship gets taken, along with the cargo. And if that sounds a lot like the drug cases we talked about, it's because it is. Different agencies, same instincts. Find the infrastructure, follow the money, and seize what you can and call it a win. From the U.S. perspective, the threat here isn't a bad captain. It's a state-backed network that uses the global energy system, tankers, ports, insurers, brokers to quietly fund things like proxy militias, weapons programs, and repression back home. The skipper is just a piece they could physically grab, and just like with Rana or the Atlanta lab or the Indiana crew, there's a public-facing story that goes with it. This isn't just cargo, it's fuel for terrorism. This isn't just a seizure, it's defending national security. None of that is completely false, but it is a choice about how to label what's happening. And here's the thread tying all four segments together. In Tijuana, the U.S. upgrades a plaza boss from a drug trafficker to a narco-terrorist. In Atlanta and Indiana, it turns 3 men in a tent into seven people into a multi-county ring into, the threat, while the demand they serve keeps humming, and on the high seas it turns a tanker and barrels of crude oil into terrorist support because the money flows into the wrong hands, which I agree with. Each move uses the same logic. If you can relabel a problem as terrorism or national security, you unlock bigger tools, more surveillance, more military, more cooperation, more financial weapons, and more aggressive seizure. And here's where I land with it. I don't see any of these actors, the plaza boss, the backyard cooks, the Indiana distributors, the tanker owners, as, mystical, one-of-a-kind monsters. I see them as the predictable output of a system we built and maintain: a global drug economy, a global energy market, a politics that loves the word threat more than it loves talking about the root causes. So when you hear that the U.S. grabbed a tanker or slapped narco-terrorism on a cartel indictment, don't just hear justice served and move on. Ask, what demand is this slot serving? What infrastructure makes this possible? And who else profits from the system staying exactly like this? And what changes for the better or worse? And when we decide to stop calling it crime and start calling it terrorism, from Tijuana streets to Atlanta backyards, from Indiana counties to ghost fleets in international waters, the faces and products change, but the machine doesn't. Networks, money, labels, enforcement, they're all the same. You're listening to Fed by Fire. If this helped you see past the press releases and into the structure underneath, stay tuned. We're going to keep pulling at these threads, not to romanticize the players, but to expose the systems that keep putting them on, the board in the first place. If you guys would like to have me as a guest or be a guest on my show, my email, it will be in the description. As always, I'll see you on the next one. Thanks.